Good morning.
Good morning.
Great to have you here. I want to welcome you to this address. Thank you for coming. It's a wonderful opportunity that we have this morning to hear from President Dunn on things relating to the SIU system and therefore relating to SIU, our campus. There are three brief announcements I want to make before I formally introduce President Dunn. The first one is I want to remind you that there will be a Q&A session after his presentation. So if you have thoughts during his remarks, you might make a little note or be thinking about the questions that you would like to ask. The second thing is, so that we all don't have a muscle spasm lurching toward that phone device the first time we hear someone go off there, let's please set those to silent. And the third thing is, after the presentation, we will have some food in the Goshen Lounge, so I invite you to stay for that. If you've been around, if you've been in this room this fall, you will know that twice already President Dunn has introduced me, and so I get the chance to reciprocate today and introduce him. He did some very nice remarks for me before the installation and before the university address. So let me tell you some things that you may or may not know about President Dunn. He began his term as the 8th president of the SIU system in 2014. Prior to that, Dr. Dunn served as president of two other state institutions, Murray State University in Kentucky and also Youngstown State University in Ohio. He was also Illinois Superintendent of Education, appointed to that role by the State Board of Education. Since his arrival as system president, he's been working hard on our behalf with the legislators in Springfield, with IDHE, and with the greater community to promote SIU. And I've had a chance to observe him in those settings, and he's very passionate for our cause. Also, about once a month, we have a conference call, and so I get a chance to listen to him and to watch him. He's a very strong voice among the presidents and the chancellors in helping us to have a consistent message, a focused message that we share with the community, with higher education, and the people of our state. So in short, he advocates for us. He's a great helper for us, and so I want to thank him for that, and I want to give you the chance to thank him for that. So would you give a round of applause and thanks and welcome to the President.
Thanks, sir. I don't need that. Well done, man. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate that kind introduction by the Chancellor, and it's wonderful to see everyone here today. What I'm going to do is really attempt a somewhat different style than I used last year in doing the State of the System address, so I hope you'll bear with me to some degree. I'm going to walk through a set of slides. I'll try to do that with some dispatch, and as the Chancellor indicated, make sure we have time for questions from all of you who are gathered here, and I know we have a few. Let me start by making just a couple of introductions. I tried to scan the crowd for any officials who came in and that type of thing, and I think we have two individuals, certainly, as my bosses, I need to introduce. So we have Chair of the SIU Board of Trustees, General Randi Thomas, one of SIU's own. Also a gubernatorially appointed trustee, Dr. Shirley Portwood. Would you give them a round of applause and thanks for being here. And if I missed any other officials, just stand and wave your hand and I'll try to see who you are and get you introduced too. As I mentioned, I'm doing this in a bit different way. I hope you'll bear with me and give me some slack as I try this. You know, it's a bit in the form of a TED Talk. Although, as many of you have learned at this point, I can't say anything in 17 minutes. So it's going to be a longer than that. Let's just acknowledge that. The other thing we don't want to have happen is the fact that it needs to stay a TED Talk, and since it's unscripted, not turn into some sort of Trump talk. That would not be good to have take place today. I wondered if I could get away with wearing a black t-shirt like Steve Jobs did when he was presenting new products and that type of thing, but decided maybe that wouldn't be the thing to do and to stay with the uniform today. Let me share a couple of things as caveats here on the front end. particularly given that it's a higher education audience. You're going to hear reference at different times to some business terms, the application of some business models. So everyone in the School of Business will be comfortable with that. For some others of you of the Academy, that may cause you to flinch a little bit. Don't let it. It doesn't mean that we're a business. It doesn't mean that we have profit motives. It doesn't mean that we're turning out widgets. But rather, there are going to be some principles that, as I talk about today, we'll look to apply in dealing with what lies ahead of us. So I want to have that as just a warning, a trigger warning maybe on the front end of things, that it's okay if we use some business application here. The other thing I would suggest to you is that in the things that I'm going to talk about, we're thinking as a system. This is a State of the System address. So my comments are going to be geared to some degree for myself, thinking about how we operate as a system, what that means for a board that comes together for governance purposes. But in any great organization, the units, the offices, departments, programs, schools, colleges, what have you, that make up the organization, in the case of a university, are all nested to some degree. So to the extent I talk about things we're thinking about as a system, if those apply to the area in which you work, all the better. And I would ask you to think about some of those things as we go, as you try to make application of what we talk about here to your own area. You know, anytime you're going to do a speech of this nature, you're trying to figure out a way to angle it, to frame it. You want something to anchor to set the stage for the speech. And I looked at different ways to do that. I started thinking about this thing this summer. By the time we get to the end of it, you'll say, you worked 3 months on this thing? But I really did start thinking about it some number of months ago. And you know, I could have gone back and really talked about the trauma that we have suffered as state universities in Illinois. And I don't think that word's too over the top. If you look at the challenges we've had, the problems we've had to work through, we have suffered trauma as a state university system. And particularly if we look at some individuals who have lost their jobs, their livelihoods, not a large number of people, but some non-tenure track, those on grants and contracts with the state of Illinois, that has been traumatizing. And beyond that, the stress to the public university system has stretched our sinews to the point of breaking. Another thing I could have done was put up about 50 slides looking at financial data, because another way to angle this thing could be to say, let's look at what we've been dealing with now, almost coming on 2 years, has cost us. Look at the financials. Let's figure out what the nature is budgetarily of this stress. And I didn't think that was the right thing either. I could have tried to prognosticate politically about what I think might happen in the coming weeks and months, and how that would impinge upon the operations of the university. And I have a line that I use. Some of you who know me have heard it 100 times before. But that line is, I can predict everything but the future. So I felt unsure about trying to take a political angle to the speech. But nonetheless, as I tried to figure out what to do with this thing, and the time we're going to spend together this morning before you get to the free lunch, is really to go back to what I think this type of once-a-year big picture speech should be. So I'm going to try to reach forward. I'm going to look at what's out there and not spend our time recounting things that have been done, both successes and challenges. You had a great State of the University speech from Chancellor Pembroke. And you know, any good thing that gets done at SIU happens at the campus level. I have a good faculty friend of mine in Carbondale, and had gone out to share a beverage with that person at one point, and we were kind of talking, and the question was raised to me, why do you even bother to do this speech anyway? There's no requirement for it per se. It's not something in my contract I have to do. And his comment was, and the system really doesn't do anything anyway. I said, thanks. But in some ways, that faculty colleague was right. We provide support. We look at resources. We try to provide lift to the work of the campuses in some of the way the Chancellor described out of the system office. But I still think there's something to be said to think about SIU writ large and try to figure out what's on the horizon for us. So you're not going to hear me go back about the past year. Also, in the comments I'm going to share, it's prioritizing where I think we go for this period ahead of us. A very uncertain period, by the way, for this period ahead of us, but it's not going to be prescribing what should happen. So for those who bought a ticket for this morning, came in to find out a list of things that will be happening either at this campus or across SIU to deal with this continuing difficulty we have from the state side, you're probably not going to get that laundry list. You're probably not going to hear those things. Rather, these are conversations, decisions that are made at the campus level moving forward. But I will tell you one thing that I hope I pivot to at some point when I quit taking all my time on the introductory slide. And that pivot needs to be about the strategic approach we take. And I don't want it to be a simplistic type of thing, although the strategy slides I'm going to move through pretty quickly because you can read the slides, you can internalize those, they're fairly intuitive. But I hope there's something strategic that comes out of the comments I'm going to share and not simplistic. So, interestingly, about this time of year, presidents and chancellors across the country get all kinds of state of the university or state of the system speeches that get delivered on campuses across our nation. And some of these presidents and chancellors think their words are so compelling that they actually publish these speeches and mail them to all of their colleague presidents around the country at some expense. So here's even what's weirder. I read some of those things. And as I get those delivered, I look at them, and I'll tell you there's a lot of them, as I've looked at speeches each year, and I don't sit there study them, but I try to give a quick skim and scan to see what the messages are going out. And it does amaze me about, not to be impolite, but how much thin gruel exists. Now, I'm going to read you a sample of one of these, and I suppose, obviously the school will go unnamed, and I suppose you could play back a video, transcribe the words, upload it to Google, and find out who delivered this speech. Please don't do that. I don't share it for the purpose of embarrassment, but this was actually one of the speeches I received in text form, and I'm going to give you a flavor of it. Because of you, we are a leading national university with a global reputation. This is not just a vision. It is our reality, and we live it every day. We are a great university, but great universities don't stand still. Every day we must set our sights higher for the sake of our students and communities and the world around us. That is the heart of our mission as a public university. It is the guiding principle that has driven, insert the name of the university, from our beginning. And if you deliver that kind of speech in very stentorian tones, it sounds fairly impressive, but that's reflective of that entire speech as I read through it. There's not a lot there. So I hope we get to a few things that suggest how we're going to create strategy for our time ahead. Here's another state of the system speech, one a little closer to home that you're going to recognize. And I don't like to read slides to people, but I am going to read this one. And you see the heading, Have we progressed in 15 years' time? You'll see who the speaker was. James Walker, previously president here of the SIU system, in his State of the System speech 15 years ago. We must not overlook the possibilities for maximizing the resources at our disposal. We need to find our niche and allocate resources accordingly. That means setting priorities. It means making tough decisions about which programs should be expanded and which should be eliminated or curtailed. Here's the question, of course. How much have we really responded to that message in 15 years? You all will come to that answer for yourselves in my mind, in many ways, maybe not a lot. Maybe we haven't risen to President Walker's charge. Maybe we hadn't been forced to deal with President Walker's charge delivered 15 years ago. I do think we may be there at this time. Because part of what I'm going to do is a bit of critique of last year's speech. I wanted to put some points up there. And for those of you who are new to SIUE, you didn't hear that speech. Lucky you. But you can get it right here. Most of the things I do in terms of public speaking have 3 big chunks, 4 big chunks. They're the big chunks. I talked about the 3 big eras of SIU, each about 70 years. Obviously, the expansion took place starting with the tenure of President Morris, really in some ways running all the way through the presidency of Dr. Pichard. Even though we had some very tough times, particularly through the Great Recessions, I could make an argument that that expansion period really carried us up until the late 2000s. And then last year I mentioned the fact that we're in this area of retrenchment. This new big period or chapter ahead of us. Will it be an era? It's too early to know. But this time of pulling in as a university, of constricting, of shrinking, of kind of pulling away. The elements of retrenchment that I talked about really haven't disappeared a whole lot. In fact, in some ways, some of those elements still exist and are certainly within the political and policy discussion right now. And then I went through a bunch of tactics. I said, all right, if the components of this pulling back or shrinking away are those, then what are the things that we do to deal with that? And we listed out the things that you see there. They came from a slide that I had up a year ago, and I was standing behind a podium. And, all those make sense still, I suppose. And then I talked about one other thing, and I'm going to come back and close with that today. Now, in anchoring that speech last year around tactics, I probably could have looked at 2016, this year, and used pretty much the same approach. I could have just listed a bunch more tactics. Come up here and said, things haven't changed. It's still doom and gloom on the state front. We're trying to hold our own together as a university system and on each of the campuses. So we must come back and look at all of these tactics again. So I said, if I wanted to do that, what would be the tactics? There they are. Those could be 3 or 4 things that we look at. I do think we have to keep working on the number of administrators. And one of the things I'm going to do is talk to the chancellors of the campuses about potential for a hard administrative freeze, a very high-level review on anybody. We're not talking about AP staff. We're talking about anybody in a managerial or supervisory capacity to force a hard review before we go in and do replacements on that. We look at that, as well as also reducing administrative overlap. This is a business term where you have more than one administrative type who's touching decisions that tends to slow down and gum up the works. We're working very hard on more grassroots political advocacy, a good tactic, an important tactic. I appreciate the work of the SIU Alumni Association in helping to bring that along. We're relying on them more and more, and they're a little nervous about it. And this is alumni associations generally, because you do, as a nonprofit, have to stay out of nonpartisan or partisan politics, remain nonpartisan, but there are things they can do, so we're trying to figure out how to really pull our alumni together to be loud voices for SIU. Obviously, we talk about those outer ring or outer tier programs of the university and continuing to work to close the revenue and expense gaps. Remember, we've talked about in the past the core, the academic programs, the critical student services, the research enterprise, those things that are the university, the next ring out or the next tier out, becoming the support services, whether it's advisement, libraries, related entities that support that core, and then a whole lot of public service work building from that. And this would include interscholastic athletics, but we've got to keep pushing more and more for those outer ring or outer tier units to work themselves toward being self-sustaining. Another tactic, it doesn't disappear. And I know all of us are working to look at academic programs and think about reprioritization there as best we can. So, interestingly, by the way, those tactics were very similar to what the provost, Nicholas Dirks, at Berkeley shared with his faculty this fall. For those of you who are fairly consistent readers of both the Chronicle and Inside Higher Education, you can go back and look at what Dirks had to say at Berkeley. By some measure, with apologies to all of you with your degrees from Michigan, by some measure, the strongest, greatest public university in our country. And they're talking about it at UC Berkeley. Well, tactics are fine, but this year we have to pivot to strategy. And let me try to do that here as we make this shift. One of the problems in talking last year around the tactics and also mentioning this era of retrenchment is that it presents the wrong narrative. Now, if I had thought through this a little more carefully last year, it might have caused me to change the speech, but I was also making the point that the ground is shifting under us, I sensed, and I wanted all of you as our university community to understand that. But now I come back a year later and say part of this move to talking more strategically about what we do from here is the fact that I think we've got to now shift that narrative, because retrenchment suggests retreat, doesn't it? And that's the worst thing for us to do. The narrative of pulling back, leaving, constricting, to use a term that General Thomas knows, retrenchment related to getting away from the front line, the battle line, is not the thing for us to be saying right now. Rather, the narrative has to be, we're going to the front line, we're going to advocate our case, we're going to look strategically at what we do to strengthen the system, not weaken it, not diminish it in this very difficult time. The tactics we talked about a year ago, and I could have talked about today but chose not to, the tactics a year ago that we continue to look at but are not sufficient now for the cause. Tactics buy time. And if you think a year ago, we didn't know where all of this challenge at the state level was going to lead. We didn't know the future that was going to be set out in the coming 12 months. The fact that this titanic struggle for the soul of Illinois, is that too over the top? I don't think it is either. This titanic struggle for the soul of Illinois as played out in the budget battle is not something we could have imagined we'd be dealing with a year later. If you think back a year, if you look at those tactics, the idea was to just figure out the right things to get us a little longer, because we thought, well, coming into veto session, something will happen. We get past the first of the calendar year in 2016, something's going to happen. As we approach the spring legislative session, they're going to get this figured out. And here we sit a year later with nothing really changed, and I would suggest to you the side's even more hardened. It's not about using tactics to buy time anymore, because we're not seeing any end of this, so it's the need for the strategic move, that shift, to deal with the fact, again, that we see the ground potentially, possibly shifting under us. That is the reshaping of the state university covenant you see in that bullet right there. And we don't know how this is going to go, do we? I can predict everything but the future. But we are, I would suggest to you, in a large, complicated, ongoing policy deliberation about the nature of the covenant between the state and its public university system. And by the way, that's not just in Illinois. You know other states are going through this as well. One that comes to mind very quickly is Louisiana. You've been reading about Wisconsin having similar challenges. But this notion of higher education as a public good, as an investment to support economic development, state growth, something that is a service that a state provides to nurture and build the common weal, that's in question now. And we don't know how that's going to play out in Illinois. But what I do know is if we don't get away from just talking about we're going to do this little fix to buy us some time here and that little fix to get us there and play around the margins a little bit to buy us one more month, if we don't understand that we have a new landscape forming underneath us and know that there has to be a new mindscape that we provide to overlay that, I think we're going to have a very difficult time. And that demands strategic response, not more tactics. Now, I'm going to share a couple graphs. I try to stay away from a lot of these data slides. I know some of you are very data-driven, as am I, and would maybe like to see 50 of these. I picked 2 just to make the point about this shift, about this landscape changing, about the fact that the ground is shifting under us here in Illinois as well as other states. Here's one bar graph I want to show you. Here's why I think the large policy deliberation we're in the middle of is not going away. This is, obviously, as you read the graph, hopefully you can see it in the back, is a comparison of pension funding on behalf of the public universities to operational funding. And you can see here, for those longtime Illinoisans, you can see here what we refer to as the 1995 pension ramp. An agreement entered into during Governor Edgar's administration to smooth out, to push out pension payments, obviously backloading those out to about 2045. And this only goes to 17, so if we would extend it on out, you extrapolate just right on up. That tells you what's going to happen to the state funding available to public higher education. Now, obviously, we're going to hope at some point to get new revenue, but you can also sense how more and more of that is going to be gobbled up, is going to be spent simply to make pension payments with less operating force. If you want to talk about the fact that they did put some money, oh, there's my laser. You do see some money in 17. If you want to talk about that, we can. That 16 money was our stopgap in April. Some of you remember that. A state payment, $50 million to the Siu System in April, and then a little over $100 million in June. Even though we used that June $106 million or so to pay 16 bills, we had to book the revenue in 17, so that's why you see that. Next slide I want to share with you is something that's hard to read. Don't worry about this. This is the state goal set forth by the Board of Higher Education that says in Illinois we're going to meet a goal of 60 by 25, 60% of the population in 2025 here in the state of Illinois having some sort of degree, certificate, high-level license, what have you. This is for all of the universities, not just SIU, and you can see on the stair-step progression to 2025, we'd been making pretty good progress, and then we drop off. If you look at SIU solely, not the entire system, our drop is even a little worse. We know that's going to continue. Now you say, hey, it's a goal, it's aspirational, we're going to have a tough time meeting it. Why worry about it? Well, here's why. In this large discussion, the policy deliberations, as the Politeugencia talks about what we do to address higher education funding in Illinois, what you're hearing about is performance funding. And some would tell you, some whose opinion I respect, that any new money for operations to the state university system, as we think about all 12 of the public institutions, is going to come through performance funding. Because of the ramp, the need to make pension payments, and we know that's not going away. We've had now enough Supreme Court cases here in Illinois to know that that ramp is probably what we're going to be living with. So to drive any more money for operations, even with enhanced revenue in Illinois, it's probably going to be through performance funding. You want to guess what the basis of performance funding is going to be? It may well be that. And we're challenged on it. So this is why I say to you, we see the landscape reshaping. The ground is kind of caving in under us. The problem is we don't know what that new landscape's going to look like. We don't know where we're going to end up and how things look in front of us when the battle, in fact, General, the war for Illinois comes to a close. All right, what do we think about then in strategic response? What is it that makes us more strategic as opposed to just figuring out a bunch of tactics that we can put in place and maybe, buy our way to the end of the fiscal year? Well, obviously you have to think about the external environment. I've been talking about that. But a strategic approach is one, again, that looks at the landscape, that looks at the ground ahead of us and tries to figure out the peaks and valleys, the drivers, the motivators, the agenda, the interests that exist out there with all actors and players on the stage of the state of Illinois. And there are many. And have a response that comprehensively deals with as many of those as possible. It's not just finding a quick fix. It's looking at things that are more structural. It's thinking about the resources we have and how we may reallocate them or handle those differently. It's thinking about deploying human talent in various ways beyond what we've done in the past. A university is a human capital organization, isn't it? In fact, today we know every organization is a human capital organization. Even my brother who works at Caterpillar knows this. How we use our talent, looking at new technologies. It's pulling together these larger pieces of what define us as a complex, non-routine organization to deal with what we see in that landscape. And then there has to be kind of a conceptual relationship where these all hang together. So there's the shift. We're going to talk about something called the strategy wheel. There it is. Now I'm not going to spend time on each of these. We're going to fly through the slides fairly quickly. And if we want to talk about them in depth later with questions or as we grab lunch or whatever, that's fine. But there's a great researcher, again, out of business, Pankaj Ghemawat. He's an Indian economist. He now teaches in Spain. He kind of remade himself into a global strategist and, goes out for thousands of dollars a day consulting with multinational corporations and thinking about global strategy. And by the way, interestingly, there's a little factoid about Ghemawat. He was the youngest tenured full professor in the Harvard Business School. Yep. So, he has this notion of a strategy wheel. You can look it up in Harvard Business Review. It's where he published a piece on it. And tried to talk about those big chunks, those main components defining strategy for global business. Well, as I looked at that, studied it, tried to think about what that means for SIU, I redid his strategy wheel. His wheel looks pretty much the same. But the components or elements of there, I tried to insert for us as a university system and force some thinking about those things. We're going to look at these in fairly short order. Again, you see the components. Obviously, the mission and purpose. What is it that defines our organization? What are we about? What is the core work? At the center of all this and the other elements, components, pieces to the periphery of that. In terms of mission and purpose, here's what I think we need to be looking at for SIU as a system. Again, does this apply to your programs, departments, schools, colleges, VC areas, what have you? I think we have to keep working on building our distinctiveness, looking at what it is about SIU that brings people to us. How are we different than UMSL? What is the case to be made for a student to come to SIUE as opposed to Indiana State or Illinois State or Western Michigan or Truman State? Pick a school if that student wants to come, Dr. Portwood, and study history. Why SIUE? We think about that distinctiveness. You're going to see more decisions made, I think, differentially. We have this notion of trying to do tactically things more across the board fashion. Everybody takes their hit. Everybody has to get their cut. And I think as you see us move forward, there is going to be more differential decision making. You'll see different approaches taken for different units. You may see some investment that goes to certain places and not others. And we have to do that if we're going to work through this. And again, we watch and learn from the competition. This is something that all of us should be doing. Let me suggest one area particularly we're going to have to watch here in Illinois. One of our competitors, and they're friendly competitors, they're good people, we rely on them as partners, but one of our competitors that we hope we then get to partner with later on are the community colleges. And you know, in Illinois right now there's great discussion taking place around the fact that the community colleges, some of them, not all, are going to cross the Rubicon line of baccalaureate degrees. We're going to have to deal with that, aren't we? Not in a way that's off-putting or damages the partnership, but we have to do things to respond. We can't try to think about a tactic politically just to kill something off or buy some time so it goes away. Strategically, how do we respond? In terms of students and programs, you can read the bullets here. And by the way, let me say this. When we talk about these changes going forward, it has some suggestion that SIUE isn't doing these things well. SIUE does a lot of these things very well. In fact, I would suggest to you that in many of these elements that you see, the system as a whole can take lessons from the Edwardsville campus about how to work our way through this. As I say at times, none of us can afford to be too smug, but I do think that SIUE in particular has been very savvy about how to deal with some of the issues we've encountered, not just during the budget crisis, but before, in terms of growing the stature of the university through some of these things. Obviously, we look at market segments that nobody else is getting at. It doesn't mean we always or necessarily abandon strong programs that we have to be a comprehensive university, but if there are things out there we can do, particularly in interdisciplinary fields, in terms of integrated programs, I think we've got to start looking at those and figuring out how to take those on, even though, God forbid, it may cross departments. Or we may have to have different folks on campuses talking to one another. Look at where and when and how we can reposition. And I'm not talking about just big structural elements here. It could be how we teach our courses, the workloads that we put together, workflow around the various structures and functions of the university, how decision making gets done. Is there any pivoting, repositioning that can be done as administrative units all the way from the program level to the SIU system to be able to move more expeditiously with this landscape underneath us, with all of the things that tend to slow us down, gum up the works, make it difficult to get decisions made, etc. And of course, in doing all of this, if we forget why we're here, we're sunk. SIUE's got that handled. It's student-friendly, it's engaging, we pull our students in on this campus, and that is at the heart of the teaching, learning transaction. I don't care if it takes place in a classroom, a faculty office, a lab, a studio, out in green space, whatever the case may be, that always has to be front of the mind. In terms of our operations and organization, you can see what's there. Oh, by the way, one of the things on the student relationship, we should always be, as an organization, working on customer service. Sorry to use another business term. And we have more than just students as customers. I don't really see students as customers. But we need to think of that responsiveness and make that better and better in terms of how we deal with all external constituencies. All right, operations and organizations. You can see things there. I don't know that I have to do a lot of explaining around that. One of the things I would suggest, though, is that, and to some degree, these all hang together, don't we? I think we have a challenge as a large, complex organization with about 7,500 employees, with those employees broadly dispersed geographically, even beyond the state of Illinois, with a lot of layers. We've got to keep thinking about how we orient ourselves to get decisions made somewhat more rapidly with a little greater dispatch, and that's going to take thinking about the processes and functions that we use in support of that decision making. And I'm not saying here, you know, we do things foolishly or uncautiously, but one of the challenges of an organization of this size, an organization this complex, is that we just get gummed up. And we've got to figure out a way to keep things moving along. And again, it's a system speech. I'm talking to myself. But you all think about that too. And as I work with the chancellors, we're going to keep looking for opportunities along those lines to be leaner, sleeker, smoother, more expeditious. Our managers also need to think about flexibility. You know, I have a general rule that I try to follow, and for those of you who've worked with me, you know, you may be laughing silently to yourself to say, you know, what a bunch of horse hockey. But I really do every day try to enter my job and think about how I can say yes to the people who come to me. And a lot of times I can't. And when I can't, I try to provide the evidence as to why that is and give a rationale. But our managers, instead of having to think about the ease of saying no because it prevents more work and having to look stuff up and having conversations with others, we need to start thinking about how can we say yes to so many things, because the good ideas, the strategic notions that are going to make the system stronger are sitting all out in this room. Go back to my earlier remarks. It's on the campuses. And we need to be hearing that and figuring out how to proceed. Also, one of the things I always tell our administrators is the fact that administration isn't applying the rule book. Black and white can be decided by a machine. Administrators work in the gray. So our managers, our supervisors have to get better at that as we look at how to do that organizational and operational shift. We have to keep investing in human capital and look at how we innovate. You know, one of the things that happens when we're in the times we're in, the retrenchment, the shrinking, the pulling back, is we quit investing in human capital. Maybe we just take a look at those two bullets together, right? We've got to keep figuring out ways to support professional development and training for our tenure-track professors who we invest in and bring to the campus. Instead of loading them up on courses, we've still got to figure out a way to allow that human capital to develop and get those individuals out presenting papers and building a network within the discipline and profession. As we look at searches, when we still get to do those, as we figure out how to get help in the external community for the challenge we have, whether it's business, nonprofit, even political types, we've got to cast a large net to ensure that we continue to find and invest in the best human capital we have. And where there's a tendency to pull away, to not do this as a human capital enterprise, again, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. How do we make ourselves better? We do not need to invent a new buggy whip, do we? But rather, as we think about programs, we have to keep responding to the markets in front of it. This bullet is just a rehash of what I had on an earlier slide in terms of thinking about the academic programs generally. What is it that it may be time to slew off? Either because the market isn't there and it's resulting in low productivity programs, because there are high demand programs out there that we know students want, that we know are needed by the workforce. I'm sorry, it's okay to be responsive to the workforce. That's what the state is going to expect of us. It doesn't mean that we turn in to trade schools. But if we think we're going to sit on this island and not be responsive to those who are paying the bills in the state of Illinois, it's foolishness. and figuring out how we look at our programs and departments that exist and try to be responsive to that. As well, in thinking about human capital and innovation, we've got to always be taking advantage of technologies that exist to help us all talk to one another, to communicate, to share ideas, to get rumors under control and all of that. And that's why, to the extent we're able to, as we move forward, you'll see continued investment in technology where we're able to pull that off. Because again, others are doing this as well, and we can't afford to get left behind. In terms of that last area of the strategy wheel, nothing you can't figure out there. The one firm brand is stealing a term from business. Again, don't flinch. This does not mean that we are creating just one university. No, no, no. Our campuses are distinct. They have different missions. The core in each is somewhat different. But there is a one firm brand for SIU, and I would suggest to you, knowing the state, talking to our elected officials, others of influence, thought leaders from around our state and beyond, including in Washington, D.C., to the extent that we can have those individuals think about SIU as an entity that helps us. And it's not to take away from any campus, program, or individual, but to say in a loud voice, SIU is the second jewel in the crown of the state of Illinois' public higher education system, and we are going to reclaim that mantle. And that happens with all of us working as one brand and one voice. At the heart, in the DNA of SIU, is our public service role. I've said before that I dare say there is no state university in the country that is more intimately tied to the region it serves, to the geographic footprint, than the SIU system. That is one of the biggest support areas we have. We cannot neglect it. Even as we talk about the challenge of the third tier entities, we've got to figure out a way not to abandon that role. Our region looks for us to keep fulfilling that in ways that we can do it. I talked about the statewide leadership, and again, as we work in this new, more strategic environment now, as we respond to what we've seen in front of us at the state level, now going on almost 2 years, for all of those individuals, groups, organizations who are going to help make our case, carry our cause, raise our flag, we have to ensure we never violate the trust relationship in terms of what we promise on our end as SIU. All right, shifting gears, and we're about at the end. On those questions that Randy talked about, we're going to go to open mic, and not too long here. If you can get that concise, it's going to get us all to the box lunches earlier. And I know for those of you who have taught here for 30 years, you would love to give us that history of everything that's happened. Maybe later. So think about the questions, because we're going to try to knock them out as quickly as we can. And yes, I understand the problem's going to be on my end more than it is yours. But I did want to share with you, and you've seen this in the connection column and some other information, the fact that the Board of Trustees, the governance body for the system, is also now, after many years, trying to also do that pivot, take us in a more strategic area. So as we think about the strategy for the SIU system, if you go on various sources to take a look at that draft strategic plan, which we're in the comment period for, you'll see a set of actions and initiatives and things that the board has indicated we think could be responsive to this strategic approach that we clearly have to get back to, if we were ever there to start with. You'll see that plan. Oh, by the way, if you haven't looked at it and wish to, it was sent in an earlier connection column. There was a link, but you can also go to the system website, SIU System, all one word, siusystem.edu, go under the Board of Trustees tab, and you'll see a pull-down menu and find that draft strategic plan. Glad to come to any constituency bodies and speak to it. Glad to receive your email comments, pick up the phone, give me your feedback. We'll make a record of that. You'll see that that plan follows a generative approach. So for those of you who are a fan of the strategic plan that has 150 steps in it, or objectives, or goals, that's not what this is. Rather, the idea on the board side is to think about this strategic approach we have to take. The strategy wheel shows us the areas, the elements, the components that we can work with, that we can play with, that we can maneuver, that we can manipulate. And then the board saying, here are probably the 3, 4, 5 strategic pillars, the big broad themes, those big chunks of work as we look to the future to provide that organizational overlay on the landscape that we think we've got. So you're not going to see, if you haven't looked at that plan, but get a chance to, you're not going to see 150 steps. You're going to see some themes, strategic themes, with some ideas underneath to get to those components in the strategy wheel. And it's not going to list out every activity that's going to take place system-wide over the next 3 to 5 years. It's going to suggest areas we might look to. Now, if you want to argue about this, we can do that later as to whether or not that's a good way to do a strategic plan. If you like the idea of the 150 objectives, I would commend you a book by one of the greatest organizational theorists who ever lived, Henry Mintzberg. His book is titled The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning. Imagine a university that on September 10th, 2001, approved with a flourish a new strategic plan with 150 steps in it. And the first step in that September 10, 2001 strategic plan said, we are going to grow our enrollment by 25% from international students. That plan was dead in the water the next day, and those internationals did not come back for about 4 years. Couldn't get a visa for anyone. So the generative approach allows us to look at the opportunities that come to us, the things that arise organically, appear, and that happens every day across the system that we can grab onto that maybe fits within those pillars, those themes, those big chunks of strategy that we're looking at going forward as a system. And we take those on, and other things that people come to us with, we say, no, we can't do it. We'd love to help you, but we can't do it because it doesn't fit. Now, you're going to also see on the plan the fact we do other types of planning, and there'll be a diagram here. I'm not going to do a lot with that. Strategic planning is really in the middle. We actually now have some metrics that cause us to think about our foundational planning. And you can also find these on the website, siusystem.edu, under the tab Data and Reports. We actually have some dashboard metrics that look at overall organizational health for the system. How we're doing on these big functions. What's our effectiveness? What's our impact? They're not real fancy graphics, I grant you that, but they're there finally. We did it all in-house. We did it with current staff. We didn't pay anybody to get those done. And if we see real soft spots there, we may have to come back and do a little plan on it. This could be at the campus level, working with chancellors and all of you, or it could be something at the system level. We also do special purpose planning. Right now, the one of these we're working on has to do with diversity and inclusion. A framework at the system level. Not your campus diversity plan. It's not what we're talking about. But a framework that the board wanted to have put in place to at least provide some lift, support, symbolic value to all the work that's taking place on the campuses around diversity and inclusion. This strategic element fits there in the middle and says, here are the new areas, the different things that help us deal with what we have. And of course it's really difficult, isn't it? Because again, we don't know what it is. We're not sure what lies ahead. It could be the case that we come through all of this, and depending on which side wins, if I can use that term, It may be that this whole discussion today was for naught. Maybe we get funded at an 88% level or a 90% level or a 92% level from what we now refer to as the last normal base, FY15. And if that's the case, we can maybe go back to some degree to working around the margins or the edges and be okay. But for the reasons we've talked about, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. There are some behavioral elements as we do things strategically. I'm guessing there's nothing there you can't figure out as you look at it. Behaviorally, in terms of our actions, we've got to do a mental shift with regard to how we work in the organizations. SIU historically has been highly risk averse. And I'm not talking about any department or individual or program or president. It's not what I mean. We're taking a broad organizational view. But we know that organizations that are in turbulent environments, where there's a lot of churning, where there's uncertainty in that horizon ahead, you have to sometimes be willing to throw the long bomb and take a risk. This has not been particularly a forte of SIU. Now, does that mean we take stupid risks? No. Does it mean we don't try to mitigate risk? Of course we do. But if we think we're just going to be able to react timidly, it's not going to work. Another problem we've had then is once we figure out the interventions is staying the course on them, not kind of getting nervous and pulling back without allowing time for the treatment or the intervention to get traction. I talked about quicker, better, flatter decision making. And here's another challenge, particularly for all of our data-driven researchers in the audience. Working in this environment, sometimes we never have enough information. We cannot wait. Sometimes. It doesn't mean we throw out the gathering of data, that we don't look at what previous work can tell us, that we don't see how other places have dealt with problems like ours, that we don't look at similarly situated institutions. But there does come a point in this environment where you have to decide we've gotten about as much information as we need to at least reach critical mass, and it's time to move. And for some of us, that's not as easy to do as others. But I do think you see this as part of the reaction, again, the maneuverability, the shifting that organizationally we're going to have to do in a more facile way going forward to deal with what we have in front of us. There's the end. If you look at the strategic plan, and I don't care. You can have your own list of values. If you want to take issue with any of those, give me some reaction, send some comments, because the board's going to keep looking at this based upon what it hears from the campus. But however you put together a list of values, my guess is generally, as a university, as a community of scholars, in the work that we do transforming the lives of young men and women who come to us, these are the things that drive us. So even though at the campus level there are going to be tough decisions to be made, and strategically at the system level we're going to be pushing in some different directions than maybe what we have in the past and trying to address things differently as opposed to just working on the margins with our tactics, there is something we do come together around, and you can see the term I used in the speech last year, that we need to be tightly coupled on, and it's the values that we share as an institution. And if anyone wants to stand up and argue them, I give you the opportunity. But my guess is, for almost all of us in this room, we came to the work that we do because we believe in these things. They define SIU, they shape our universities and our system, and we stay close to those, don't abandon them, and that gives us the ultimate map as we move forward. All right, now we are going to work through quickly some questions. I think there are some runners. Doug told me communications and marketing had some folks who would take mics around. Again, concise, short, to the point. I'll try to make myself do the same. And we'll kind of go until everybody just starts abandoning us for the Goshen Lounge and free box lunches. This was a big question today, so we made a little bet as to how many lunches to buy. Because we extend our appreciation to Rachel Stack and the SIUE Foundation, the support they provide to the President's office, pays for lunches to everybody. But I didn't really want to buy too many lunches, so we had a little bet going on about how many boxes to get. I think I can safely say everybody gets lunch today if you want it. All right, where we got the questions go, sir? Nice and loud.
Sunday, I heard the superintendent of Edwardsville School System talking about Proposition E. Public education, I just found out, in Illinois is the 50th lowest funded of all the 50 states. And I looked at your graph up there about performance. We have allies in the public schools. They're facing the same kind of challenges. And that's part of our community that we need to work with.
Great question, and elegantly concise. It wasn't even a question, was it? I should just shut up. But you are absolutely correct, and those cords, those ties are out there to K-12. Let me just share a little something with you so you're aware. K-12 has its budget for 17. Now, yes, you're absolutely correct in terms of level of funding for K-12 being low as it is for higher ed. Although there is this thing that if you count pension contributions, and if elected officials want to do that, it jumps our ranking up, doesn't it? But if you remove pension contributions, then yes, we're at the bottom of the barrel on the K-12 and higher education sides. The challenge is K-12 has their money for FY17. And you know how human nature works. If you don't have to take on a battle that's not yours, you maybe tend to fall back a little bit. And I think now, to some degree, we have K-12 resting a little bit because they're okay for this year. But your larger point, I absolutely agree with my own professional discipline in K-12. I hope I can add some value in bringing them along. Because your larger point, I absolutely think is right. But right now, they're kind of... Yeah, higher ed, you all get out there and get your money. We're okay for this year. But ultimately, we're going to be arm in arm with them. Thank you. I'm waiting for the insurance question. Where is it? Let me deal with that while a couple of you are thinking, it must be time for lunch. Let me deal with the insurance question quickly because we've been following the listserv, and I've had a couple of emails and calls on it. So we right now are in the midst of a big problem, it appears, particularly, and again, I don't want to simplify, and you're going to say, you know, he didn't give me enough information. I'm trying to give you what I know at this point. But it appears right now that we have a particular problem with those individuals receiving their group insurance through HealthLink, and particularly providers on the Missouri side of the river. Now, that's not to say things haven't slowed down and it's getting difficult with providers all over. It is. It's very tough throughout the entire footprint of the system. But HealthLink with Missouri providers seems to be a tough go right now. So let me share a couple of things. For those of you on other plans, particularly Cigna, same type of thing as we've said before. Keep passing those pieces of information on to HR. Let us know what's going on out there. With regard to HealthLink, particularly, we're trying to figure out what strategies can be within the playbook. In fact, this morning had a contact with a staff member in the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. They know what is going on. This is not a surprise, and as you would well guess, it's not just SIUE. It's all of the state employees, particularly in this part of the state, who have HealthLink and are using Missouri providers. One of the things that had been thrown out there Legally, I don't think we're going to be able to do it, but as I talked to Luke this morning, we'll at least give it a look. And that's this notion of escrowing the premiums that are getting paid on behalf of you all for payments to HealthLink, holding that back and creating then a pool to make available as providers. We don't think that's probably going to work. And get it, you're in a catch-22, I know. Because what I'm given to understand is HealthLink is not going to release anyone. We're not into the open enrollment period. HealthLink's not going to release anybody. They're no dummies in that regard, I suppose. So we're between a rock and a hard spot. We will look at that, though. Is there ability to create this pool of funds that we could use to maybe deal with these providers? I don't think that looks promising. For those of you who would say, well, you know, if that's not the case, then we need to think about a reserve pool of our own to be able to do that in and of ourselves. I've heard general buzz. I don't know if they're going to do it. I've heard general buzz that University of Illinois is looking at this. Obviously, given where HealthLink is headquartered, a lot of HealthLink subscribers within the state group health insurance plan up in the Champaign-Urbana area particularly. They haven't declared anything. They haven't said they're doing anything in terms of the number of claims paid in the millions and millions of dollars. I just don't think we're going to have the wherewithal to do that. Maybe if it was 10 or 15 years ago, maybe if the unrestricted balances were different, that's what we were living with back in those days, maybe we think about that. At this point, I think that becomes a very difficult road to travel. So we're looking to find out more. GOMB's been in contact with us. In fact, I told John Charles, who many of you know leads our governmental affairs shop in Springfield, if there's any update to text me. I haven't gotten a text. But we're going to work it even to the point where a number of us may come together and down in this area for what it may be worth and go see HealthLink and say, listen, you've got to loosen this up. I understand it's tremendous pressure. It is an unsustainable situation. So we're going to work it in the areas we can work it. There are not many quivers in the arrow. Let me say this. For those of you who live in Illinois, this is why we have elections, and you go vote. And you look at those individuals who you think can get this addressed and figure out a way forward and make your choices accordingly. Again, I hate to hearken back to this notion of the titanic struggle for the soul of Illinois, but it is driven around the budget and the level of services and support provided to all of us within the state, whether we're employees, recipients of social services, students in higher education institutions, what have you. So I wish I could give you more, tell you more. I don't have it yet. We're going to try to work it. I'm not giving you a promise about it, but we are going to try to work it to see if we can kind of turn the screws on HealthLink or have some tool otherwise to get this addressed, because it's a terrible situation to be put in. And I'm glad to talk to others out here after as we eat some lunch. We got one or two questions left if you can get them set, or maybe everybody's just ready. You know, one of the neat things about doing kind of a big address, whether it was Randy's or coming together for the system, which again I thank you for, and it's so neat to see, as you get started, you just kind of have to get everybody to stop and sit down, because there aren't that many times over the course of the year where you have the chance to come together to fellowship, to see friends from across the campus, maybe a couple of the speeches, the holiday deals. What's that thing that we do in the spring here, where we ride the big trikes and jump in the jumping deal, and what do we call it? Springfest. Chancellor Pembroke, you'll really have a fun time at Springfest. Just don't get in the bouncy ball thing, because we're too damn old for that, okay? But it's wonderful to see everyone come together and get a chance to get back with friends and fellowship. I hope as you go to Goshen, get a lunch, you'll have some time to stay, talk to some people. You know, we're going to be fine at SIU. We don't have an existential crisis. These shifting sands, you're going, shut up already, Dunn, I'm done. These shifting sands of the landscape are causing some of our sister institutions to crumble right now. You know that. 2, maybe 3 wonder if they can make it through the year. That's not our question at SIU. Part of this big public policy deliberation among the politigentsia and thought leaders and influencers and big foundation funders and rich people and all of the elites, one of the questions has to do, or maybe a series of questions has to do we need all of the state universities? How much degree duplication should we allow? Does every university have to have a bachelor's degree in, shall we pick on you, Shirley? Let's pick on, no, I won't pick on your department. Does every university have to have a bachelor's degree in philosophy? Is that what the state must oblige itself to? So there's this huge set of conversations, deliberations, discussions, arguments taking place that ultimately, depending on how all of this comes out, will, again, last time I'm going to say it, change that landscape. And some of our colleagues at other state universities are going to have a very difficult time surviving that. That's not our problem here. That isn't our challenge. Rather, it's thinking about where we take ourselves from here, the goodwill that you have for your institution, exemplified by showing up today, the willingness to keep investing heart and soul in SIU, to carry that flag. That's the greatest power that we have going forward. We just need to be louder and stronger with our collective voice, and I know you're the ones to do that. Appreciate your time. Find lunch in Goshen. Good to see everybody. Thanks, everybody. Go Cougars.